Was John Wayne a fraud? For decades, he was the bedrock of American masculinity, the grit, the gun, and the law. But beneath the Stetson lay a darkness that finally caught up to his ghost. A resurfaced interview didn't just tarnish a legend, it sparked a war over the very soul of the Duke. Was John Wayne the hero we needed, or a meticulously crafted lie? The icon of freedom is now a monument under siege, facing a final reckoning. Imagine a smoke-filled room in 1968. The air is thick with the scent of rebellion and the sounds of a radical folk singer named Phil Ochs. He stands before a crowd of young anti-war activists and says something that stops them dead in their tracks. I think that John Wayne is one of the greatest men ever to step in front of a camera. The audience laughs, assuming it's a joke. But Ochs doesn't smile. He mumbles into the microphone that nobody takes him seriously. He was touching on the ultimate American paradox, the fact that our greatest artists are often the most reactionary, the most intelligent in their medium, but the most troubling in their hearts. To understand why a radical leftist would praise a conservative giant, we have to look back at what John Wayne represented to a country in flux. He wasn't just Marion Morrison, a boy from Iowa. He was the definitive alpha male. By the late 60s, as the world burned with civil rights protests and the Vietnam War, Wayne stood as a granite pillar of the old guard. He was the man who took what he wanted and apologized to no one. For millions, he wasn't just playing a character, he was the physical embodiment of the American dream, carved out of the red dust of Monument Valley. He was the father figure for a nation that felt it was losing its way. Yet, there was a hollow echo beneath the spurs. While his contemporaries like Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda left the limelight to fly combat missions in World War II, Wayne stayed behind. He sought deferment after deferment until the war was a memory. This secret shame, this want of service, is perhaps what fueled the hypermasculinity of his later years. He overcompensated on screen for the courage he failed to show in reality, creating a version of manhood so rigid it eventually became a prison. He didn't just play the hero. He became a caricature of the protector, a man who believed his own myth so deeply that he forgot where the actor ended and the legend began. This myth held firm for decades, surviving his death in 1979 and the changing tides of Hollywood. But the digital age has a way of exhaling the ghosts of the past. When an obscure interview from 1971 resurfaced in the modern era, the Duke didn't just look like a man of his time, he looked like a relic of a mindset many thought had been buried. The words he spoke to Playboy magazine didn't just divide his fans, they threatened to dismantle the very airport that bears his name. The hero of the West was suddenly cast as the villain of a new American narrative, forcing us to ask, how much of our history are we willing to burn to find the truth? As the debate intensified, the world was forced to confront the ugly reality of his words regarding white supremacy and the selfish nature of Native Americans. It wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a fundamental clash of values. His family, led by his son Ethan, rushed to the front lines to defend a legacy they felt was being stripped of its context. But as we peel back the layers of the Duke's carefully constructed armor, we find a man far more complicated than the cowboys he portrayed. He was a man who preached rugged individualism while hiding behind the safety of a movie set. But the true weight of the scandal didn't lie in his politics alone. It lay in the terrifyingly honest way he viewed the survival of the white man in a stolen land, a view that would eventually set his legacy on a collision course with the 21st century. To understand the explosion of the 1971 interview, we have to understand the character John Wayne had spent 40 years building. He didn't start as the grizzled, iron-willed patriarch we remember. In his early days, in the black and white era of the 1930s, Wayne played charming, brash young men. He was flirtatious, almost adolescent in his energy, playing off worldly actresses like Marlene Dietrich. He was a boy in a man's body, a symbol of American potential that hadn't yet been tested by the fires of war or the bitterness of age. But then, something shifted. In a single cinematic leap, he skipped the stage of marriage and domesticity and landed squarely in a weary, suspicious middle age. This transition was most visible in his landmark films like Red River and The Searchers. In these stories, the Duke wasn't just a hero, he was a man irrevocably divided from the idea of home. He became the Dark Knight of the American frontier, a figure who arrived after a trauma that the audience never saw but could always feel. He was the precursor to the hard-boiled detective, a man whose bitterness was a fait accompli, a fundamental part of his DNA. He represented a dark, soured romanticism that suggested that to be a real man in America, one had to be fundamentally alone, damaged, and perpetually moving away from the warmth of the hearth. Critics often look at his roles in The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance as his true legacy. These weren't just movies, they were psychological studies of American manhood. Wayne embodied our national ambivalence, our attraction to violence, our fear of the frontier ending, and our tortured relationship with women and domestic life. He was the paternal figure that a generation of Americans yearned for, someone who would do the dirty work, the violent work, so that everyone else could sleep soundly. He was the man who held the gun so we didn't have to, and we loved him for it, even as we flinched at the darkness he carried. But there was a price for this projection. By becoming the personification of American grit, Wayne lost the ability to be a human being in the eyes of the public. He became a monument, and monuments are expected to be perfect. He stood as a symbol of an era where right-wingery wasn't just a political stance, but a moral framework for survival. This persona was so persuasive, so overwhelming, that it masked the contradictions of the man himself. The man who avoided the draft while playing the ultimate soldier, the man who preached freedom while embodying the rigid structures of the past. Yet, as the 1960s gave way to a more cynical decade, the armor began to show its cracks. The world was changing, but John Wayne refused to move with it. He sat down for an interview that he thought would solidify his stance as the defender of traditional American values, but instead, he laid a landmine that would wait 48 years to detonate. In 1971, at the height of his fame and political influence, John Wayne sat down with Playboy magazine. It was meant to be a candid look at the man behind the legend, but what came out of his mouth would eventually become the blueprint for his modern-day cancellation. When the topic of race relations and civil rights came up, Wayne didn't mince words. He stated plainly, "I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility." It was a statement that stopped the room then, and it continues to send shockwaves through social media today. He argued that the country shouldn't be turned over to black leadership overnight, framed through a lens of paternalistic control that many found abhorrent. The interview didn't stop there. Wayne turned his gaze toward the very genre that made him a god, the Western. When asked about the portrayal of Native Americans as villains in his films, his response was cold and clinical. He dismissed the idea of stealing the country, calling it a matter of survival. To Wayne, the Europeans needed the land, and the Native Americans were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. It was a staggering admission of a worldview where might made right, and where the progress of one race justified the erasure of another. He even compared the history of slavery to a child getting polio, a fact of life that one simply had to live with, showing a profound lack of empathy for the generational trauma he helped dramatize on screen. When these comments resurfaced in the digital age, they didn't just cause a stir, they ignited a wildfire. For a modern audience, seeing America's hero defend white supremacy and the displacement of indigenous people was like seeing a beloved grandfather reveal a hidden, hateful identity. The debate quickly moved from the pages of history to the real world, specifically to Orange County, California. This is the home of John Wayne Airport, a place named in his honor shortly after his death. Suddenly, a movement began to strip his name from the terminal, argued by those who felt that a public facility shouldn't honor a man who held such divisive and exclusionary views. The backlash was swift from the other side. Wayne's supporters and his son Ethan argued that it was unfair to judge a man's entire life based on a single interview from nearly half a century ago. They claimed he was a man of his time, reflecting the common prejudices of a generation that had long since passed. Ethan Wayne insisted that his father treated everyone with respect on set, regardless of their background, and that his true character was found in his actions, not his words to a magazine. They saw the attempt to rename the airport as cancel culture run amok, an effort to erase history rather than learn from it. But the 1971 interview was more than just a collection of bad takes. It was a window into the soul of the Duke persona, a persona built on the idea that the world belongs to those strong enough to take it. As the controversy grew, it became clear that this wasn't just about an actor, it was about the stories America tells itself. The Duke was a mirror, and for the first time, many Americans didn't like what they saw looking back. To understand the intense scrutiny John Wayne faces today, we have to look at the foundational cracks in his legend that started long before the Playboy interview. The most glaring contradiction in the life of America's ultimate soldier was a simple historical fact. When the real war came, the Duke was nowhere to be found. While Hollywood legends like Jimmy Stewart flew dozens of combat missions over Europe and Henry Fonda served on a destroyer in the Pacific, Marion Morrison, the man who would be Wayne, spent the 1940s in front of a camera. He sought and received multiple draft deferments, citing family dependency and later professional necessity. For a man who would become the face of American military might, this was a secret that gnawed at his soul for the rest of his life. This wasn't just a personal choice, it was a career move that changed the trajectory of Hollywood history. While the true heroes were away at the front, risking their lives and losing their spots in the limelight, Wayne was filling the vacuum they left behind. He became the war hero by default, portraying the very men he had avoided joining in the trenches. By the time the veterans returned, they found a public that had already embraced Wayne as the definitive symbol of the American fighting man. This irony wasn't lost on his peers. There was a quiet, simmering resentment among those who had actually bled for the flag, watching a man who stayed in the safety of the studio become the nation's primary source of patriotic inspiration. Biographers later noted that Wayne carried a deep, private shame about his lack of service. He spent the decades following World War II overcompensating, becoming more hawkish, more aggressively patriotic, and more vocal about American dominance than almost anyone else in the industry. It was as if he were trying to earn the uniform through his rhetoric because he hadn't earned it through action. This psychological weight transformed him from a mere actor into a political crusader. He didn't just want to play the hero. He wanted to be the moral compass of the nation, leading a charge back to a version of America that was uncomplicated, traditional, and, in his mind, unquestionably superior. But as the 1960s rolled in, this overcompensation took a turn into the deeply controversial. His need to prove his patriotism led him to become one of the most polarizing figures of the Vietnam era. He wasn't content with just supporting the troops. He wanted to shape the narrative of the war itself. He became a man who viewed any dissent as a betrayal of the American spirit, setting the stage for a cultural clash that would eventually expose the darker side of his convictions. The mask of the Duke was becoming a shield for a man who feared that the world he understood was slipping through his fingers. Yet his most aggressive attempt to defend the American image would lead to one of the most mocked and debated films in cinematic history, proving that when the Duke fought for his version of the truth, he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his artistic reputation. By the late 1960s, John Wayne had transitioned from a movie star to a political institution. He was the personal friend of Richard Nixon and the vocal champion of the silent majority. But his greatest effort to influence the American mind came with the 1968 film The Green Berets. Disturbed by the growing anti-war movement and the way the Vietnam War was being portrayed in the news, Wayne took it upon himself to create a piece of pro-military cinema. He didn't just star in it, he directed it, pouring his own money and his entire reputation into a project designed to justify the bloodshed in Southeast Asia. It was a film that painted the conflict in the same black and white terms as his old westerns, good versus evil, civilization versus the savage frontier. The reaction was a precursor to the polarization we see today. To his fans, the Green Berets was a brave stand for American values. To his critics, it was a delusional piece of propaganda that ignored the horrific complexities of the war. But for Wayne, the film was a necessity. He felt that the Hollywood he helped build was being taken over by subversives and perverts. In his infamous 1971 interview, he lashed out at the new Hollywood films like Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy, using homophobic slurs to describe characters he felt were eroding the moral fiber of the country. He saw the shift toward realism and grit not as artistic progress, but as a direct attack on the American ideal of the strong, silent man. This rigid adherence to a pure American identity extended to his views on the Western genre itself. Wayne viewed the history of the frontier not as a story of displacement or genocide, but as a grand, necessary epic of European expansion. To him, the Native Americans were merely obstacles in the way of progress, a view he defended with startling coldness. He believed that the strength of the white man was what gave America its right to exist, and any questioning of that history was, in his eyes, a sign of weakness. He was the architect of a mythology that intentionally left out the voices of those who had been crushed under the heels of his boots, creating a vacuum of truth that the next generation would eventually fill with rage. As he aged, Wayne became a man out of time. He was a 19th century figure trying to navigate the complexities of the 20th, and the friction was starting to generate heat. He didn't just represent the Republican Party, he represented a version of white patriarchal dominance that was being challenged on every front, from civil rights to the sexual revolution. He stood his ground, refusing to apologize for his views on race, gender, or history, believing that the Duke was untouchable. He was convinced that the American people would always choose the legend over the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. But what happens when the legend is no longer enough to hide the man's words? As the 21st century dawned, the defense of John Wayne would fall to his family, who found themselves trying to protect a legacy that was being torn apart by the very things the Duke had said in his moment of total, unfiltered honesty. For nearly 40 years after his death, John Wayne's legacy sat undisturbed, like a statue in a town square that everyone passes but no one truly looks at. He was the Duke, a permanent fixture of the American landscape, safely tucked away in the nostalgia of late-night cable westerns and Father's Day movie marathons. His contradictions, the draft dodging, the hyper-nationalism, were known to historians but largely ignored by a public that preferred the myth to the man. But the digital age has a way of exhaling the ghosts of the past, and in 2019, a single spark turned into a firestorm. An old interview, buried in the archives of a 1971 magazine, was pulled into the light of the social media era, and suddenly, the Duke wasn't just a movie star anymore. He was a contemporary political flashpoint. The impact was immediate and visceral. When a writer for the LA Times named Michael Hiltzik revived the Playboy interview, he wasn't just reporting on a piece of trivia, he was asking a question that a modern, more diverse America was finally ready to answer. Seeing the words, "I believe in white supremacy," attributed to the man who represented the best of America, felt like a betrayal to millions. It wasn't just the political right versus the left. It was a fundamental reckoning with the imagery of the 20th century. For a generation raised on the internet, there was no context that could excuse such blatant language. The legend was stripped of its cinematic lighting, leaving only the harsh, cold reality of a man defending a racial hierarchy that the country was still desperately trying to dismantle. This digital resurrection created a bridge between the 1970s and the present day, proving that the culture wars Wayne fought in his later years never actually ended. They had just been waiting for a new battlefield. The interview became a viral weapon, shared and dissected by people who had never even seen a John Wayne movie but knew exactly what he represented. To the modern eye, Wayne's dismissive comments about the selfishness of Native Americans and the inevitability of slavery weren't just old-fashioned, they were dangerous. They provided a historical lineage for the very ideologies that were currently tearing the social fabric of the country apart. The Duke had become a symbol once again, but this time, he was the face of a heritage that many felt was long overdue for a total demolition. The backlash sparked a terrifying question for those who still held the Duke dear. Can a man's entire life be defined by a single hour of conversation? The debate wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening in a world where statues were being toppled and institutions were being renamed. The controversy quickly moved from the realm of academic debate to the very soil where Wayne had lived and breathed, putting his name on the literal chopping block of history. But as the world outside screamed for justice, the battle moved to the one place that bore his name with the most pride, an airport in Orange County that was about to become the epicenter of a cultural civil war. John Wayne Airport in Orange County, California, has long been more than just a transit hub. It is a shrine. Since its renaming in 1979, shortly after the actor's death, it has served as a gateway to the region Wayne called home, complete with a 9-foot bronze statue of the Duke in full cowboy regalia. To many residents, the name was a badge of honor, a tribute to a man who represented the rugged, conservative spirit of the old OC. But as the 1971 interview spread like wildfire, that shrine began to look like a monument to exclusion. Democratic leaders and activists in the county began a formal push to strip Wayne's name from the airport, arguing that it was an insult to the diverse community that now lived and worked in the shadow of the Duke statue. The debate became a microcosm of the national divide. It wasn't just about John Wayne, it was about how we handle the difficult parts of our heritage. Does a person's contribution to art and culture outweigh their personal prejudices? Can we acknowledge the truly great artist that Phil Ochs spoke of while condemning the reactionary man? As the calls to remove the statue grew louder, the focus shifted from the Duke's words to his actions, leading to a deeper investigation into whether the John Wayne way of life was a reality or just another meticulously crafted performance. But beneath the legal arguments and the political protests, a darker realization began to take hold. Perhaps the reason we can't stop talking about John Wayne isn't because of what he said, but because of what he reminds us about ourselves. The scandal surrounding John Wayne is more than a debate over a few ugly sentences in an old magazine. It is a confrontation with the very foundation of American storytelling. For nearly a century, Hollywood has been obsessed with the myth of the lone vigilante, the man who operates outside the law to protect the innocent. John Wayne was the architect of this archetype. His films weren't just entertainment. They were blueprints for a specific kind of American manhood that prioritizes retribution, violence, and a rigid, almost biblical sense of justice. When we look at the Duke, we are looking at our own deathless obsession with the Dark Knight, the damaged paternal figure who carries the weight of a violent world so that we don't have to. This obsession explains why his legacy is so difficult to dismantle. It has been argued that John Wayne is simply the Western equivalent of Humphrey Bogart, a Bogart for the masses, who believed himself superior to the complexities of urban life. Both figures represent a deep-seated American yearning for an isolated hero who is irrevocably divided from the comforts of home and womanhood by a trauma that happened long before the story began. We are drawn to this soured romanticism because it offers a simple solution to a complex world: a gun, a horse, and a clear enemy. To reject Wayne is to reject the allure of the frontier itself, a prospect that many Americans find physically uncomfortable. However, the task ahead of us is not as simple as pointing at a dead man and laughing at his bigotry. The real challenge lies in dismantling the patriarchal white supremacism that his films so effortlessly reflected. The Western genre, as Wayne played it, wasn't just about cowboys and Indians, it was about the justification of conquest. By portraying the taking of the country as a matter of survival and the indigenous population as selfish obstacles, Wayne provided a moral cover for a historical catastrophe. This cinematic framework allowed generations of viewers to enjoy the thrill of revenge and retribution without ever having to confront the reality of the victims left in the Duke's wake. We must ask ourselves why we still find these narratives so intoxicating. Is it because we truly believe in the rugged individualism he portrayed, or is it because we are afraid of what it means to be a man in America without a weapon in our hands? Wayne's persona gathers all these unspoken anxieties: the call of the frontier, the fear of the feminine, and the dark pleasure of violence, into one persuasive package. No wonder we flinch when the mask is pulled back. We aren't just flinching at his words. We are flinching at the reflection of a culture that built its greatest hero out of a history of exclusion and a refusal to look the truth in the eye. The debate over John Wayne is ultimately a debate over our national mirror. He was created by a Hollywood that wanted to believe in a pure, uncomplicated American spirit, and he played that role to perfection until he began to believe it himself. But as the credits roll on the era of the unquestioned hero, we are left with the fragments of a man who was both a cinematic genius and a deeply flawed product of his time. The question isn't whether we can still watch his movies, but whether we can watch them and finally see the ghosts he was trying so hard to hide. The dust may never truly settle on the plains of Monument Valley, but as we look at the world the Duke helped build, we realize that the most difficult trail is the one that leads us back to our own complicity in the myths we choose to believe. Today, the statue of John Wayne still stands in Orange County, and the airport still bears his name, though the battle over its removal continues to simmer in the halls of local government. His son, Ethan Wayne, remains the steadfast guardian of the flame, tirelessly working to ensure that his father is remembered for his work and his perceived character rather than his most controversial statements. The Duke remains a titan of the box office and a permanent fixture in the American psyche, but he is no longer untouchable. He has transitioned from a universal hero to a complicated symbol, a monument that is both admired for its craftsmanship and criticized for what it represents. The story of John Wayne is the story of America's struggle to grow up. It is the story of a nation that wants to believe in its own goodness while ignoring the shadows it casts. The Duke taught us how to be strong, how to be silent, and how to stand our ground. Now it is up to us to learn how to be honest. We can appreciate the power of his films and the undeniable magnetism of his presence, while still acknowledging that the world he fought for was one that left too many people behind. His legacy is a reminder that even our greatest icons are made of clay, and that the American dream is a work in progress, requiring more than just a fast draw and a steady gaze. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of an American icon. If you found this analysis insightful, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the figures who shaped our history. What do you think? Can we still call John Wayne a hero in the 21st century? Or is it time for the Duke to finally ride off into the sunset? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective on this enduring American paradox. 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 Paradox.